It's interesting because when the first congregation that made up this congregation was gathered, white European people who lived right where we live now had an entirely different, like a 180-degree different concept of nature than we have today. So let's start there with the psychological evolution of the concept of open space. Because to the 17th century Protestant immigrant mind, open space was terrifying, wild, threatening, godless, something to be conquered, tamed, and domesticated. Looking around and not recognizing or respecting the native people's ways of using and owning land, they thought it was all there for them to own and claim and take over and use in their ways. Their biblical attitudes about man's dominion over nature laid the foundation for over-extraction of resources from our environment and got us where we are today, where we, their spiritual heirs, must undo these attitudes and practices in order to protect those very open spaces that the first members of our congregations regarded as intimidating and unruly. So, full circle. I grew up in Connecticut on Mianus Road, named for a chief of the Sinowoi tribe, which was off of Wahakme Road, and just down the road from Toquam Road and Chichester Road. My elementary school was located on Ponus Ridge Road, named for Chief Ponus of the Rippewam tribe. Our house was set back in the woods up a long, steep driveway, although I revisited a couple of years ago, and it wasn't as steep as I remember it. We used to sled down and go whizzing across the street. Woods were all around us, and we could not see our closest neighbors except in winter when the trees were bare. Because of the street names all around us, I grew up with a keen awareness that European Americans had not been the first settlers on the land I called home. I wondered why I didn't know any Native American kids or families. The names were all around us. Well, where are the people? I grew up a busy suburban kid, going to lessons and rehearsals for shows and for choir, and taking the train into New York City to visit my dad at his office and to participate in all sorts of cultural activities. We watched a lot of TV at home. We read a lot of books too, and we listened to records and went to friends' houses. My mom always drove, and we rode our bikes, and we went to the movies. But always there was the woods. The woods full of absolutely nothing but trees and wind and fields and moss and this really big beetle that we called the Wednesday beetle that would come out with this disgusting goo coming out of it that my sister and brother and I were completely obsessed with. And when we saw it, we screamed and ran. But then, of course, we always looked for it again the next week. My mother was always trying to get us out of doors. Get some fresh air, she'd say. And I'd just go off into the woods. There was nothing there but everything. The sun and the crunch of the path under my sneakers, and maybe someone might go by on a horse on rare occasion. The bird song was wonderful, although I always meant to but never learned the name of the birds who were singing. That's why I rely on John Benson now to help fill me in. Nor did I ever learn the names of the plants and trees and flowers I saw, although I always meant to do that too. I guess I existed kind of like Adam and Eve did before they were given the idea to name everything. I would often find a mossy spot in one field whose beauty I can still call to my memory whenever I want to, and I would take a nap, even though I was always a little bit afraid in the woods and of the woods. I hunted for arrowheads and for Indian graves. We all did, all us kids. And when we found one, we were thrilled and we were reverent. We'd go to the nature center over on Owen Oak Ridge to have our discoveries verified or debunked. At school, while the other kids played on the cement playground, Shay Harden and I went into the woods during every recess and built a fort out of big sticks, branches. Our fort fell down most every night, and we rebuilt it again the next recess. It was our swearing fort. Shay was newly arrived from the South, a very well-behaved little girl who was very, very smart and wore pretty little pinafores that I coveted. And I wanted terribly much to impress her, scrappy and ungirly as I was. So we built our fort, and I swore like a sailor there, teaching her all the dirty words I knew, away from the ears of peers and teachers. I was always a little bit afraid of the trees, though, thinking that they might be listening and judging my stupid, puny human self. In adding up all of the things that have influenced my spiritual life, I would not have tended to credit my childhood messing around, catching frogs, and making leaf potions in the yard. I wouldn't have credited that with much but happily wasted leisure time. But when the Green Sanctuary Ministry team announced that they were choosing open space as their theme for the year, I had an opportunity to really think about how impoverished my own spirit would be and would have been without the quiet power of the open spaces in my childhood. It was in those spaces that I learned that there is a world soul, and that it is ancient, primordial, and magnificent beyond my or any one person or people's individual lives or concerns. In open spaces, I experienced what Thomas More calls a transporting charm, when you become profoundly entranced and the heart is overwhelmed by beauty and imagination is electrified by some haunting quality in the world. Members of the Green Sanctuary Ministry team described for me at their meeting on Friday night, some of the reasons that this topic called to them, why they chose it as their theme for this year. Well, for one thing, Tara Gallagher reminded us, appreciation and reverence for open spaces lead us to an awareness that their protection and preservation is a matter of environmental justice. And I'll just give you one example. The Lynn Woods protects the city water supply for the city of Lynn. And you'll learn more about the Lynn Woods this afternoon at the forum. Nancy talked about growing up crabbing in Old Saybrook, a childhood spent without a tether to the mobile devices that now occupy so many of her daughters' and her daughters' peers' hours and attention. Trinidad, who grew up in Venezuela, grew up camping, and now she says she goes camping yearly, and before they really get started, she says, I have to go off into the woods and hug the trees and cry. and she said, I need that time. And so she needs that to teach her son Caleb that the woods belong to him as well and to love them. Chris Hansen talked about how she and her family would set up camp on Race Point at the edge of Cape Cod for 6 to 8 weeks in the summer. That's a long time. 6 to 8 weeks with nothing but just your campsite. And they made a bathroom, in case you're wondering. They just created one. And she talked about different groups and ethnicities and people from Canada and people speaking different languages would all just be out there camping through the whole summer, becoming a community and getting out their instruments and playing music at night and sharing a cooking fire, and how amazing that was for her formation. Tony talked about going to Cutty Hunk, and how her son Dave built a shack there one week with a friend. Just getting out there, uninterrupted time to do those kinds of basic human chop wood, carry water tasks that are so alien to so many of us now. So many of us who would have no idea how to build a simple shelter if we needed to. Because my stick fort in the woods, I'm telling you, wouldn't cut it if I really needed a simple shelter. These are all stories of feeling at home in open spaces, feeling that those spaces belong to one, and that one belongs to those spaces. And it's wonderful to have that kind of relationship to the land and the water, the beaches that we live on and around, or get to visit. But I want to say, I wish I had a better kinship with open spaces. I'm working on it, though. I remember being called to be the minister of a congregation whose opening activity for the program year was to go camping. And this filled me with tremendous dread. And sometimes I'll tell you the story of what happened when we went camping in a hurricane, essentially, and how the tent fell in on me in the middle of the night as the campground was flooding, and how I screamed and tried to struggle to get out of the tent until I pulled it open and stuck my head out like some kind of deranged bird being born from an egg, and yelled till somebody had to rescue me. So, growing up with a strong connection to my Jewish heritage, we would always joke in my family, the Jewish side of the family, the Jews don't camp because we've spent 40 years in the wilderness. And why would God have invented hotels if he wanted us to sleep in the dirt? That's a joke, but it's also a very real cultural difference that my parents, they didn't know from camping, and nature at all. Nature was something that you hoped to overcome by migrating away from the farm and the open spaces to live in a beautiful house and to have some land and that so on. So I used to go to Girl Scout camping trips very ill prepared. I'd come home with that list that they send home with you of necessary supplies. And my mother, who had never camped in her life, would sort of throw a few things together for me and say, "You'll be fine, this is fine." And my father was equally clueless. Guess what? It wasn't fine. And my counselors needed to provide for me, bless their hearts, because my parents didn't know how to do so appropriately. So I appreciate being invited to participate in open space adventures by people who are more confident there and more experienced, who can help me overcome my sense of awkwardness and even aversion to roughing it. For some kids, they don't even get the opportunity to be sent on a camping trip at all, ill-prepared or not. I spent a week volunteering with the kids in community camp over at St. Stephen's in Lynn this summer, and Suzanne Forgione and I volunteered for a week. And they had their playtime out on the Lynn Common, a little strip of grass in between two very busy city streets. So I've wondered, and with some of you, if we had a shuttle, we could maybe bring some of those campers here for a very easy access nature walk or shady playground time one day a week. All children should have access to fields, prairies, beaches, forests, and woods where they feel safe and welcome. Welcome to explore and experience the enchantment of the natural world that so enriches the soul, where, in the words of Thomas More, again, literal concerns of survival and daily preoccupation at least momentarily fade into the background. It is wonderful to love the earth and all her landscapes and to cherish time spent in open spaces. We should protect them. We should support conservation. I love this quote by John Levinson. He said, "Geography is a visible form of theology." And somewhere in each human, I believe, there remains at least a vestige of the primordial, universal religion of our relationship with nature. Now, I have said that I was often afraid in the woods, well away from the structures of human culture. I still am. But I've learned that that fear was not a bad fear, but it was actually that good fear that we call awe. The awe that is the root of reverence and of all spirituality. Out in open spaces, I still feel that good fear, that awe. And I know now that it's not because I don't like being out there so much as it's because I understand what our grand open spaces are doing to me when I am out there. Specifically, when I am out in open spaces, nature is putting me in my place. Nature is putting me in my place as a New Englander, as a citizen of Earth, as a lover of her many landscapes, but an owner and controller of none. Nature has always, and may forever, put us in our place. Not as lords and masters, not as having those who have dominion over, but as respectful children and heirs who owe her our allegiance and respect. May we have the wisdom to fear her in that beautiful and blessed way.